Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate your engagement and feedback on this topic. I'm Lauren Hale, Communications Assistant for Federated Farmers, and with us today we have National President and Climate Change Spokesperson for Federated Farmers, Andrew Hoggard. We have North Canterbury Farmer and Waka Eke Noa Steering Group Representative for Federated Farmers, Henderson. And finally, we have Macauley Jones, our Senior Policy Advisor for Federated Farmers on climate change. So today we will be doing a run through of what's currently happening with Waka Eke Noa and the pricing options and what we think about it, what are the key issues, and then we'll follow up with a Q&A. So please remember to put any questions in the Q&A chat box. Awesome. So passing on to Macauley to give a bit of an introduction.
Thanks, Lauren. So we'll go, yep. So I'll just give a quick background, and then Andrew and Cam will outline some of what we see as being some of the core unknowns and issues we've got at the moment, and what we're seeing as being possible solutions. So I'll get through this as quickly as possible to allow as much time for that, and most importantly of all, questions from you guys. So a question we get a lot is why are we doing this at all? And that's largely because in 2017 the government was elected with the policy of bringing agriculture into the ETS. So they went down a work plan, and they formed a working group as to how to do this. We were involved in that, and towards the latter stages of that, when it was pretty clear they were going to bring agriculture into the ETS at a processor level, all those industry groups you see down at the bottom got together and put forward Waka Eke Noa, or the Primary Sector Climate Change Commitment, as an alternative means of pricing agricultural emissions to achieve the same ends but in a better means. So that would involve the work plan we've set up now, and to do it in a way that works with industry groups, with farmers, and hopefully lower global emissions while maintaining food production. So that was the goal of Waka Eke Noa. And in late 2019, the government accepted this proposal, and Waka Eke Noa was established. If we go to the next slide, please. So along with putting forward an alternative pricing mechanism, there are a number of other legislated milestones. The government put in amendments to the Climate Change Response Act. So these largely fit into these four broad categories, which involve farm planning and emissions reporting. So farmers need to know their numbers, their nitrous oxide and methane numbers, and have a broad farm greenhouse gas emissions component of their farm environment plan. And that goes back to both awareness and, you can't manage what you can't measure, that old saying that people have to say. And that's the tools you're using to get your numbers. They're not necessarily the same tools that we'll be using for the pricing system, as we'll touch on later, but they're really good for farmers to just know more about how emissions link into their farm. But it's that last point is where the rubber hits the road for many of our members and you guys, is where the price, what's it going to cost? What's involved here? And that first dot point is what we're working on now, and that's providing a report to ministers that will outline recommendations of a pricing mechanism. So government then will take that report, and then they'll receive advice from the Climate Change Commission, and they'll decide what they want to do. If we go to the next slide, please. So it's been 2 years now that we've been chipping away as a partnership. So as you saw in the first slide, that there's about a dozen about a dozen partners, including industry, FOMA, who are representing Murray Agribusiness, and the government themselves via MPI and MFE. So a broad range of stakeholders. And so there's been a need for a lot of compromise and a lot of different stages of groups in putting forward policies. So we've got 2 broad options that we're consulting on now. So that's a farm level levy and the processor hybrid levy. And they operate on this A plus B minus C system. So then the document and the consultation also outlines the third option, and that's bringing ag into the ETS, the government's policy that they put into legislation as a backstop. So we didn't support this. We've got policy regarding pricing ag emissions, and the backstop is there largely as a control to see what the alternative would look like. If we go to the next slide, please. So there's a visual illustration of how those two options stack up. So as you can see, they broadly achieve the same ends, but through different means. If you're on your computer, now might be a good one to do a screenshot, because it's a really good diagram. Cam did it, so potential illustrator here for Feds, as well as a farmer and a steering group member here, Cam. So, and it shows that A plus B minus C system really well. So that's A being the price face for methane, B being the price face for nitrous oxide, so that's short and long lived gases, and C being the price received for sequestration. The reason we've done it this way is to avoid the need for metrics, and to have a means of converting the warming impact of methane and nitrous oxide. As you know, there's a bit of a gulf between us and government and how we want to do that. So rather than doing that, we've just done it on price. So I won't get into the details of the two options too broadly, but the farm level levy works on calculating your emissions on farm, whereas a processor hybrid levy works on calculating the outputs of your farm, but then works to incorporate some of the benefits of the Waka Eke Noa options. And if we go to the next slide, please. So here's just a quick one where we've gone through and we've compared them to Federated Farmers pricing principles that they date back to, I think, about 2017. So Feds, they're not necessarily opposed to pricing ag emissions. There can be a role for doing so to reduce emissions, and that can include ag in the ETS. But in order for it to make sense for both farmers and the climate, it needs to happen in a certain way. So the first one is, does it support a split gas approach? And so we'd say both the Waka Eke Noa options do. There's a bit of uncertainty as to how that will be interpreted. As Andrew and Cam will touch on, there's going to be a panel set up. So, but there is scope to do that. And as it stands now, there's no scope to do that under the ETS, and very major changes that have to be made for the ETS for that to be possible. The second option is, does it exclusively incentivize the use of cost-effective mitigation tools? And neither option really stacks up against that at this stage, because even if you're using all the mitigation tools you have available, you likely will face a price, and a significant price. So that's one. Hopefully the options incentivize the use of these tools, and once these tools go through the appropriate framework to get them green lit, and get those reductions counted, they can be used to incentivize. They can be incorporated into the system, but not exclusively at this stage. And then the last one, does it not make sure it doesn't put New Zealand farmers at a competitive disadvantage? And at this stage, while there's talk of premiums from markets and some products are getting them, all three systems will be an added cost, and to what extent that cost will be, both in setting it up and the actual levy itself, we're not quite sure of yet. There's still work going on there, but at this stage, it looks like all three will be a cost. So if we go to the next slide, please. Brilliant. So here's what we see as the rundown of the key issues, and what we see as being remedies to these key issues to make the Waka Eke Noa workable. But we do want to hear from you guys more, and I'll hand it over now to Andrew, and Andrew will cover some of these issues, and then Andrew will pass it along to Cam.
Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I'll try not to spend too long on this, because I know from the last webinar we spent a long time doing Q&A, and I guess that's the reason most people want to come on and ask their questions and get some answers to it. But just so what we've got here is 7 areas where we see as where both options, or I guess the first 4 I'm primarily talking about the farm level option, where there's issues we see that kind of haven't been resolved yet, and or could potentially lead to problems in the future, where we're not 100% on board with that right now, and some of the changes that we think could occur to improve that, and make it a bit more real, give a bit more sort of certainty to farmers, and take away some of the unknowns. So on the first issue, governance and price setting. So the concern here is, we know there's going to be some sort of group that eventually, if these options, the Waka Eke Noa options, or one of the options gets chosen, then there will be some sort of governance body or advisory panel set up that will give guidance around what should be the price. But what we don't know is what price they're going to set. So at the moment, in all the documents you're seeing numbers, basically what we're relying on there is ETS numbers as a placeholder. We don't really know what the numbers will actually be until this advisory panel sets itself up and decides on what the price is going to be. And so there's a lot of uncertainty around what the price could be, but also who would be on this panel, and also what factors they're going to consider for the price. So obvious remedy is a price ceiling. And so we've floated the idea that no matter what, the price under Waka couldn't be any more than what the price under the ETS backstop would be. Making sure that for any sort of final documentation given to government, that we need an absolute clarification, and we need to be crystal clear on what factors are going to be considered and what factors wouldn't be considered in terms of setting that price. And probably a key one would be what is having some sort of industry control over part of that committee, whether that be that we as an industry nominate X number of people that will be on that committee, or we provide a list to the minister and he can select from that list, but ensuring that we get people that we trust on that committee, as opposed to, ministerial appointments. And we all see all the various bodies that get set up by government, and it's usually, jobs for mates sort of approach, or people that think like them. So, what we want is ensuring that, there's some good solid thinkers on that committee who will look at, the things that we consider vitally important. The second issue is around the revenue recycling. And again, whether it's this initial price setting committee that's going to decide that decision, or whether there's going to be two separate committees, it would probably, the concern will be how this revenue, the funds are recycled. What are the decisions made? You can imagine there's the potential risk for people wanting to sort of have their pet projects pushed forward, and minister putting on someone from a green NGO who wants to spend everything on teaching us how to farm organically without fertilizer, and people want to do that, that's cool, but I don't think there's a good number of farmers don't want that. We want to farm our way. So if there is to be two separate bodies, we think one of the certain remedies would be keeping the people that are on the price setting one separate from the revenue recycling, to provide some sort of non-conflict of interest in that regard. Because you can imagine if there's someone from an organisation who's setting the price also happens to be part of an organisation that's going to receive some of that revenue recycling, from the outside perception, that's not great. So that's one potential area. Another remedy would be, again, more clarity, or in the document that's provided to government, clear direction is given as to what we view as being acceptable on what that revenue can be recycled into. A key issue for me would be that we're spending some of it on, and this will come up in a further point, around data interoperability, and also tools on farm to actually make getting all the information you need for these levy, or this system, the farm plans, etc., easy and simple to do, particularly with sequestration. So if we have smart technology that doesn't rely on someone with a clipboard walking around your farm counting trees, but able to use modern technology to be able to work out your carbon storage on farm, that sort of stuff would be not only very useful for the hay waka process, but also they have co-benefits in other areas. Now, the third issue, sequestration. There's a couple of issues here. So obviously we all know that there's a whole bunch of sequestration that's happening on our farms at present, which can't be counted in the ETS, be it, riparian strips that aren't the right width according to the Kyoto rules, regenerating native bush, shelter belts, erosion planting, things like that. And so there's one of the benefits of Waka Eke Noa is the work that's going into being able to count that and get that increased inclusion. But there are some, a number of members have brought up concerns around not counting for pre-2008, etc. So, we'll be looking to ensure that anything is able to count for as much as possible, so long as there is actually additional sequestration happening. One of the other problems that seems a bit strange at first when you think about it, but hopefully you'll understand when I've finished explaining, is the fact that the payments for all the sequestration come from the farm levy. So it's all farmer money going to pay for this. And at the moment, it's the rule is it allows for the inclusion in Waka Eke Noa of some ETS eligible vegetation, native planting. Now, the problem we see there is if Waka system is simpler than ETS, then you'll have people preferentially putting it into the Waka, particularly if the prices were to be linked. And we could end up, creating quite an amount of sequestration that we have to pay through via farmer money, rather than that having to be paid through with the ETS. So the likes of Air New Zealand and other industrial users or purchasers of carbon credits paying for the sequestration, it'd be other farmers. And that, of course, risks this possibility of basically more, and if there's a lot that we have to pay for, then it could chew up all of the funding, or it could actually mean we've got to lift the levy rate to enable us to pay for all the vegetation, or we have to pay it at a rate that's lower than the ETS, which again would probably, there'd be a bunch of farmers go, hang on, this isn't fair. So our view is what we need is either it's a system where if it's ETS eligible, it can only be in the ETS, it's not in Waka. And then also, as we, through Waka, validate and put some science around some of these other forms that are currently non-ETS vegetation, then shift them through into the ETS so that that payment then occurs through there. Or if it can be done, that you can do the recording through Waka, but then the payment through the ETS. And I think it's important, if we think about the concern a lot of us have around what we're seeing with afforestation happening around the country. We've got a very tight carbon market, a lot of demand, and that's sending up that carbon price. If we're able to include all of these shelter belts and everything else that's happening on farm into that market, it actually increases the supply, thus reduces the demand to a degree, and hopefully will take some of that pressure off for afforestation that's occurring, where you've just got the blanket planting of farms. So that's a key issue for us. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yep, there we go. And the fourth point I want to sort of talk about, admin costs. So as you'll be aware, and this is really related to the farm level proposal, the admin costs are quite high for it. And, I sort of mentioned this before, that one of the remedies is that we can actually use the revenue recycling to minimize those admin costs and also ensure that, hey, Waka's linked up with everything else that's happening in the recording space and with all the productivity tools, that we try and use it to really reduce those costs down. Because one of the key concerns I would have with the processor hybrid levy is that we get stuck in it, and that you get bureaucratic inertia where something starts and no one wants to move on from it, and we get locked there. So if we're able to use some of that revenue recycling to ensure that smart systems come in place around data interoperability, etc., hopefully that would reduce those admin costs, although I still believe they're probably slightly overrated what they think the costs are. And we'll be having a survey coming out hopefully today or tomorrow that actually asks you what your thoughts are around those admin costs, and would it take that amount of time for you to fill that information in. But I'll pass over to Cam now to cover the last 3 points.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We'll work through these pretty quickly. So number 5, the recognition of early adopters. So that's looking at when we recycle the revenue and provide incentives for farmers to change a particular part of their system to perform a certain action that's going to reduce emissions, that we want to make sure that those that are already doing a good job, that are already implementing those actions on farm, also get some level of reward. So for instance, if we only started incentivizing actions after 2025, why would you go and do anything between now and then if you're only going to get reward for things you do after 2025, just as an example? So action-based revenue recycling is basically designed to ensure that no matter when you do that action, whether it's plant an extra tree or put a riparian strip in or use less fertilizer, that it doesn't matter whether you do it today, you did it 10 years ago, or you do it in 5 years' time, that you get the reward as soon as you've completed that action. So it means that those early adopters, those that have done a good job for a while now, don't miss out on any of those incentives. Number 6, international competitiveness and avoiding emissions leakage. So you guys will all know that New Zealand is the most efficient producer of a lot of our agricultural products, particularly meat and milk. So that means that if we produce less meat and milk over time, and the demand is still there, that production will get picked up by another country. Another country will produce that meat and milk for the market, and they will be less efficient at it than we are. So it might mean that we might save a kilo of methane in New Zealand, but someone else producing it somewhere else, the milk somewhere else, might end up producing 1.5 kilos of methane to compensate for our lower production, which ultimately climate change is a global issue. It doesn't actually matter whether the emissions come from New Zealand or US or Australia. It's a global issue. We all want to reduce emissions. So actually the global answer to that is not to be cutting New Zealand's production. I think it's a concept that's fairly well understood. It's in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So really our design needs to be, we're not paying farmers to produce less, because ultimately that's bad for everybody. Number 7, the relationship between He Waka Eke Noa and the government's emissions targets. Now this topic it's had a lot of attention, and rightly so. The emissions targets, so that's the 10% reduction in methane by 2030 and 24 to 47%, I think it is, by 2050 for methane. They are closely linked, those targets are closely linked to He Waka Eke Noa, but it's been a policy of all the agricultural partners that have been involved to keep that argument separate. So any agreement that we have within He Waka Eke Noa is absolutely no agreement to the emissions targets at all. We haven't discussed it within He Waka Eke Noa. We wouldn't achieve agreement on it even if we tried. And really the only way of making He Waka Eke Noa work is to keep those two items separate. So we'll continue, Feds and others continue to talk to government outside of He Waka around those emissions targets and push for more scientific outcomes. But for He Waka Eke Noa to be successful and to stay out of the ETS, really we need to be separating those two arguments, which is why we're asking farmers, one of our big questions is, should we be doing that? Should we be making it part of our continued engagement, Fed's continued engagement with He Waka Eke Noa? I guess the flip side of that is that if we do require emissions targets to change as part of He Waka Eke Noa, the likely outcome is that He Waka Eke Noa would fail and we would end up in the ETS by the end of this year and the targets don't change at all, which is not a good outcome for farmers. So just something to ponder, and we're really keen to hear your feedback on that as well. So with that, I will pass back to Andrew.
Yeah, so I'll just go through what the sort of stages or the process for Federated farmers is. And so we've got a special general meeting on 2nd of March with all our national council, which comprises provincial presidents and industry groups, to decide where we go from here. Basically, all the sort of feedback, etc., is completed by the 18th of March in terms of He Waka Eke Noa, and then there's sort of over the next month and a half decision time and a lot of argy-bargy between the members as to what sort of proposal gets put in front of government. It's pretty hard to say what it's going to look like because there is a fair degree of different opinions on some certain key items. So those will be some interesting decisions. But for us as Feds, we're talking to all our provincial presidents as to what is our position. Are we going to walk away completely? Are we going to say we've got some bottom lines, or are we going to endorse? We'll endorse a proposal if there are certain bottom lines met, or is everyone happy that, hey, this is better than the ETS, so let's go for it? I mean, just on that, I think everyone needs to, really consider this when they're thinking about, particularly when you're filling in our survey. We'll be looking at that survey really carefully to see where people are thinking, and you really have a think about it as if you were in my shoes and you were the one effectively making the decision as to whether we're in or out, or our provincial presidents in this case. Because, like Cam said, if we say, nah, we don't want to be part of this, then in all likelihood, it is the ETS that we will be facing, the backstop. Now, of course, they have changed the ETS every single year. So at the moment, yes, the ETS is worse than both options. There is always the potential that they could make changes to it to make it slightly better, but it's still going to be the ETS. The other thing to consider, of course, is if we then all say, well, this is the least worst option, so let's go with it. I always feel bad. I don't think it's great if you just select something on being a least worst option. It should actually stand on its own merits. But if that was the case, everyone was to say, okay, let's go for it because we don't want to end up in the ETS. If all of industry agree with that, with government, then there is not much in the way of likelihood that any future government would change that, not for a number of years, unless it proved to be completely and utterly disastrous. So it would be very hard for us to say to the government, if we all lockstep as an industry said, we want to go with this proposal, the government agreed, and then a new government comes in and we tell the new government, hey, that actually sucked, we change it back for us, please. They're not likely to do that. So, of course, then if we say, well, we don't really like this option, let's just say no. So an incoming government will have the ability to change it back. Past history tells us that if we look at the previous John Key government, there was a whole bunch of previous stuff from the Helen Clark government that they never changed back, even though there wasn't, widespread support for it. So yeah, it is a bit of a tricky situation to sort of decide on which way you go. I guess for me, I always sort of fall back on what are my principles, and also, I'm there to represent farmers, so it's about what is your views, what do you think are the important principles we need to consider. But look, I've talked for long enough. Let you guys ask your questions.
Awesome, thanks Andrew, and thanks to the rest of our speakers. So we'll go on to Q&A time, and don't forget to put any questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Don't forget our app, Fed's Voice, as well. You can find that in the Play Store for Androids or the Apple Store for iPhones, iPads, etc. And if you'd rather just sit and listen for this and record a question after, you can get a recorded answer for your question. Okay, so we've got some pre-submitted questions, and I've got one here that also goes with a question in our Q&A box already around the Paris Agreement and how it's a legally binding treaty, that those who signed up to it have to stick with it. And basically the concerns are, has this been discussed within Waka Eke Noa, and why are we letting this continue? Is there any way we have explored legal remedies to avoid this tax or levy on our food production systems if it's going to impact food production globally?
So I'll give that one a crack. In terms of the Paris Accord, and how we've considered that within Waka, I think the key thing there has been the focus around emissions efficiency, emissions leakage. So there is wording in the original document that I nearly know off by heart, but I'm pretty sure Mac knows word for word off by heart, which is, that it'll incentivize the uptake of economically viable mitigation tools that result in a reduction in global emissions, meaning that we're not just going to cut production here in New Zealand, that anything that a pricing mechanism does, it should actually result in lower global emissions. Now, the emissions leakage report that's been done under this has shown that for beef, I believe it's a 15%. And so if we were to reduce a set amount of New Zealand beef production, there would be an extra 15%. So of those emissions that came away from that production being taken away, there would somewhere else in the world, those emissions would come back again, plus an additional 15%. For dairy, it was 30%, and for sheep, it was 7%. So really, I guess I think people need to have if you feel like digging through the reports, there is stuff on what is the production input. I don't quite know it off by hand as much as I did that last number. Perhaps Matt can help out, but there are production impacts that differ from the various options. And I guess the question comes back to, is that made part of the, so the sort of criteria that the pricing committee must adhere to and look at in terms of actually, is this going to lead to lower global emissions? Hope that answers the question.
Did you have anything to add to that, Mac, or would you?
Yeah, I'll just add on. So the tough thing for us now is that there's no price being proposed, right? So the two Waka Eke Noa options use the ETS price as a placeholder to compare like with like. But as Andrew touched on, the price will ultimately be set up by a committee. But using that placeholder price, I think the production hybrid was estimated to reduce dairy by about 5% by 2030. I think sheep and beef, it was about 1%. And I think 2025 it was lower, but I think it was 2 or 3% for dairy and very little for sheep and beef. So it's on the basis of modelling, and we've brought in the best people in the business to do it, but it is modelling, so we've got to take it with a grain of salt. But there is inherently a conflict between achieving the goals of some partners, which are the targets, and achieving the goals of other partners, which for us isn't designing a system that reduces emissions at the cost of food production. So that's the tension that we're trying to grapple with, and we're trying to say, and that comes through in the survey. How important is that? Is that a factor that the panel or whoever going forward, Feds included, hopefully, should consider and should balance with other factors? Or is that a sort of line in the sand that is non-negotiable? And as regards to the Paris Agreement, that's a good point, and it's a point we've got a lot now in feedback through to us to date, and that's one, frankly, that some organisations aren't as worried about as others. We can put in our model that it'll expect reduced production, but you could plausibly say that a technology will be developed that'll find a way out of it, or others have interpreted the Paris Agreement differently, saying that those sections argue for deeper cuts in agri emissions, even if that comes at the cost of productions now, to ensure that the changes in the climate in the future don't reduce ag emissions. So that's an alternative interpretation that we certainly disagree with, but that's sort of the conversations we've had. So that's just know that, I guess, for members, that's a point that Feds have been pushing, and we just want to steer from you guys in that, and in that survey as to how strongly to push for that, because at an industry level we don't want to see that happen. Certainly for some farms it'll make sense to reduce production in some areas, and that's something that New Zealand farmers have been doing. Some farms have been doing, and some farms have been going the other way, and that's we don't want to set the industry in stone right now, but we want to steer from you guys as to how firmly those points in the Paris Agreement should be pushed, because through our involvement at the World Farmers Organizations, we're involved in that wording of the Paris Agreement, and that's something that we do value. We think it really adds to the agreement, and we want to see how important is that for you guys in Waka Eke Noa.
And just leading on from that first question, one of the key concerns that we've found from feedback, and one of our questions today is, are any other countries including agriculture in their ETS? And it seems to be a key concern for many.
To the best of my knowledge, not at this point. There are very similar reductions being asked in Ireland. Myself and Mac, we had a video conference call with the Irish Farmers Association a good month or two back, and they're facing very similar rules, but I don't believe there was any talk of an ETS for them at that stage. I don't know of any others. Mac, you were on a WFO call recently. Were there any other countries looking at this?
Yeah, so a lot of countries, as you say, Andrew, are looking to reduce ag emissions, are looking to incentivise the things we're looking to incentivise, but none, to my understanding, are looking to price ag emissions to the extent that we're doing, and none are looking to bring ag into an ETS. There are some countries that have emissions trading schemes in which agriculture is excluded, not just directly for their emissions, but farmers can get a rebate for their petrol and power. So yeah, I think that's the difference. And countries that are using subsidies, so countries and economies using subsidies, there's a lot of talk within them for repurposing those subsidies to achieve, ag emissions reductions. So rather than charging farmers, for not doing it, or for doing it as well, they'll be paying farmers to do it. So that's, it's a tricky issue for us, but yeah, the international context is, and we're involved in quite a few groups, and I don't know if there's any of you've come across CAM or anything as well, but there's no one talking about bringing agriculture into a national emissions trading scheme.
Okay, one of our next pre-submitted questions, it's an interesting one to see your guys' comments on this. How can a tax on production lower on-farm greenhouse gas emissions? Farmers will either lower production to lower tax liability or increase production to pay the tax.
Yep, that's exactly what will happen. So the early modelling, you might have seen in the original discussion document that came out last year, it talked about putting a price on emissions from agriculture would only lower emissions by 1%. And that's exactly what the ETS on its own will do. If we're paying the prices that are being modelled within the ETS, you only get a 1% reduction for exactly that reason, that some will increase production to pay for it, others will just pay for it and it'll come out of their pockets. But ultimately, it just didn't make a lot of sense to just rely on pricing alone to achieve our outcomes. And so the actual key to achieving meaningful reductions is that revenue recycling, or the modelling. That's what the modelling is showing, is the revenue recycling, putting the money back in and incentivising certain actions is where we start to see some meaningful change happen. And that's really where the two options for Waka Eke Noa, and depending on whether you believe the government or not, they think they'll introduce that into the ETS as well, but there's nothing written on paper with that yet. But so the Waka Eke Noa options, the pricing itself is not going to deliver much change at all. It's the revenue recycling that makes all the difference.
Awesome, thanks, Cam. Next one we've got is, what is the basis of Waka Eke Noa's proposal agreeing to a 10% reduction in methane by 2030?
That's no part of Waka. None of us have agreed with it, that reduction. So ourselves, Beef and Lamb, Meat Industry Association, we all are submitted on the fact that it should only be a 3% reduction by 2030 and a 10% reduction by 2050 based on the GWP star metric, if you've heard of it, or that the whole warming argument, the short life of methane warming argument that I'm sure you've all sort of heard if you haven't followed the metrics and all the other little acronyms, etc. So that's where we have sort of focused our attention. That's where we've pushed, and we basically disagree with the government around those targets. Dairy NZ did agree to, or in their submission, they did say 10% by 2030, and then I think it was 24% by 2050. And the dairy company, some of the dairy companies agreed with them, and other dairy companies were in our camp on that one. But there is, as part of Waka, there has been absolutely no agreement around the targets. And in fact, I'm surprised Mac has as much here as he does, because every week there's usually some little bit of wording in a document that tries to sneak in that we agree to this target, or to give some legitimacy to the targets that we usually push back on and sort of throw our toys out of the cot and refuse to stomp, or threaten to stomp out and not play nicely. So yeah, we've been fighting to make sure there is no sort of endorsement of any government targets through this process. I hope that answers the question.
Can I just add to that? So if you think about Waka Eke Noa is designed to deliver on whatever targets are in place at the time. That's ultimately where we're thinking of it coming from. And so if we can get this in place and then push the argument for changing those targets in the future, and remember, this is more than just about methane. This is about nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide emissions, which there is a strong argument they do need to go to net zero. So have that targets debate outside of Waka Eke Noa, and then Waka can deliver on whatever those new targets are. And I believe there's a review of that, Andrew, is at 2024. Those targets come up again. So this is not agreement to the next 10 years worth of emissions targets and pricing. This is purely on an incentive system to help achieve whatever targets in place. There's absolutely no agreement on those targets in this agreement.
Yeah, and if I could just add, if you use the analogy of the IRD system compared to other countries in the world, we've got a fairly efficient tax system in terms of the collection of it, and by and large it's reasonably painless in terms of form filling, etc. Whereas you look at other countries, it's an absolute nightmare. But just because we agree that the IRD does things reasonably well, it doesn't mean we agree with the top tax rate or tax increases, etc. So, that's how I, if you use that sort of analogy, that's how I'd sort of split the two apart.
And just to confirm, that is part of the survey and feedback we need from farmers is, should changing these targets be a prerequisite for signing up to anything like Waka Eke Noa?
I'll just add to that too, Lauren. So we talk about contributing towards the targets, and that's something we've put in the document. That's one of the goals of this panel, and that's the disagreement on the targets that Andrew and Cam have talked about. Is that's why there's a need for a panel, right? You can't set up a market mechanism when you when different partners disagree on the destination. So that's been challenging. That's been a core. That agree to disagree principle has made it tough to date, and that's where we've tried to, it's where we've get like the A plus B minus C approach. So that's, we've stayed away from metrics there, and that's something that we've had to show it's credible to achieve the targets for government. So government want to see something that could possibly achieve the targets, and we've shown, look, if you put the price high enough, yep, this option can achieve the targets, but that comes at other costs, and that's how we've had to weigh that up. That's those ultimate decisions still haven't been determined. The 10% targets in the CCRA, where they came from was the Berg report, and the government said that's basically the most that's possible. We'll put that in there because that's this report says it's the most that's possible. There's a lot of problems with that. If you want to bore yourself to death, you can go through our 2019 submission on it, but basically that 10% was all emissions and not just methane, and it stacked different mitigation potentials together that can't be stacked together. So yeah, we still disagree with that 10% target. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but we're trying to between Andrew, Cam, and I, trying to thread that balance of saying, look, this credibly could hit any target, including the ones the government's put down, but we don't agree with them or endorse them. And is that an approach you guys want to hear from want us to keep doing in the future, as you say, Lauren? And that's in the survey, definitely.
Awesome, thanks guys. So I've got a question here that I'm going to combine with another, as it's coming up more frequently now, is the reputation cost of federated farmers agreeing to a plan which is scientifically flawed and not yet defined, as well as farmers protesting in the streets about overburdening legislation and compliance. It will be significant, and are we, federated farmers, prepared to take that risk?
Good question, and that is why we're having that meeting on the 2nd, to get our National Council in line. To be honest, and my personal view is, I would think we would need to have a lot of guarantees around this system before we were to progress with it. But we will certainly, like I said, that member feedback is going to be critical to us as to how we move forward with this. So make sure, I know it's a bit of work filling in the survey, but do fill it in, and do pass your thoughts on to your provincial presidents, but also consider the alternative around, yes, it might mean we go into the ETS, and if that's where if members want to take a stand and say, screw this, I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees, cool, I'm happy to do that and take that stand. But another analogy I'd use is, kind of, it might be a bit like running across no man's land. And I just, with the way my farm's set up, I'm sort of not going to be in the first line of people charging machine gun nests. So I don't want to make that call for you, because some of you are going to be in that first rank that gets potentially mowed down, to use a crude analogy. But look, we'll be taking member feedback on this, and certainly wanting to see some solid, gains in the proposals on this. That's probably about all I can say for now until we've had that meeting on the 2nd of March.
Okay, next question. At the farm level, are there still simple and complex methods of recording farm emissions?
Mac or Cam?
Yes, there is. So the design at the moment is to have a more simplistic way of, backing up a little bit. I think it was at Mac Andrew talked about, at the moment, there's about 10 or 12 different tools you can use to calculate your emissions. They're all dependent on the organisation that's created them. There's some that are more accurate than others, depending on how much data you put into it. What Waka is planning on doing is designing their own reporting system, and that's because they've got special needs. So as soon as you go into pricing a particular item, in this case emissions, you can't have 12 different ways of doing it. It'd be like having 12 different versions of the IRD calculating your tax. It would just be too complicated, and arguably farmers would just find the one that would charge them the least and go with that. So Waka is designing its own calculator. So there's at this stage, two versions that would be created. A more simplistic calculator that would be easier to fill in, faster to fill in, require less information, but is most likely to, if anything, overestimate what your farm emissions are. The other option is a more detailed version. It takes in more information, would take longer to complete, but is more likely to be an accurate representation of what your emissions are. And so that'll be the trade-off that each farm can decide if we go ahead with those two options. Is, do I want to spend more time and get a more accurate number, or just fill in the easiest one and just pay whatever it is? And ultimately that's probably going to come down to price, that hey, if filling in the detailed one saves you 10 or 20 grand potentially, then it might be worth the effort. And that's still some of the detail that we've yet to see, but at least farmers will have that option.
Okay. Is there real pressure coming from our customers for us to join such a scheme, or is the pressure coming from low-level New Zealand politicians?
So I guess in terms of the customers, predominantly what I've heard and seen is a focus around per kg of product. So if you use the example of some of the big dairy companies, be it Nestle, Danone, whatever, that they want to be able to go to all of their customers and say, hey, we've reduced our footprint per kg of product by 15% or 20%. And so what they go back to Fonterra or Synlait or whoever is, right, all the stuff we're buying off you, we need it at this much less per kg of product in terms of the footprint. Now, of course, the lucky thing for our dairy companies at the moment can be that they can then turn to those companies and say, well, you can pay us a little bit more and maybe we'll be able to do that, but we may not be able to do it. And if you want to ditch us, good luck finding someone else that can get it at the current low footprint we're doing. So really, from my understanding is the international context is really all about the kg per kg of product. It's that footprint intensity where you've got products that are going, consumer facing. Some of the feedback I've had at international conferences has been customers, their default thing they look at is pasture grazed. And so if it's pasture, the animals are grazing on pasture, they just assume everything else is fantastic with the product. So yeah, I don't think there's customers that are going, oh, you need to be an ETS. It's more about the actual product that they're focusing on. So really the whole ETS pricing of emissions, it really is a local thing. All of the international stuff is focused around actually, reducing the footprint of the product.
Just to add to this, and I would never say this in front of a government panel, but at the moment, our current position is we are the most efficient, particularly at meat and milk in the world. But most of you will have seen there is a lot of R&D going on, particularly into TMR type systems that could rapidly reduce their emissions, particularly of methane. I can't. Is it
Bovamere?
Yeah, Bovamere. And so while we're currently in a good competitive position from our customers' eyes, that could change pretty quickly. And so I guess part of this is making sure that we can maintain our position as the world's most efficient, because as soon as we're not, a lot of those arguments start to work not for us but against us in terms of international supply and emissions leakage and all those sorts of things. So part of this is to help us stay in our position as the most carbon efficient farmers in the world.
Who will be deciding what modelling will be used to measure what needs to be measured? And how will this be monitored to see that it's still relevant, accurate, and understood by farmers?
What modelling precisely are we? I don't know, Cam or Mac?
I'm guessing that's relating to things like pricing decisions and revenue recycling, and how do we actually come up with, what does this thing look like in a couple of years' time? We might set a price, but if things change and new technology comes along, or prices of milk and meat change, which means that ultimately the pricing probably needs to change. Yeah, good question. And that comes back to Andrew's comments before around governance, is that we don't want people that might want to do us more harm than good making those decisions going forward, that we want a level of independence, at least as a bare minimum. Even better than that is just being able to put good agricultural people, good agricultural minds onto that governance committee going forward, so that there's always good decisions made in the best interest of agriculture.
Yeah, just to add to that too, so far there's been a lot of modelling done, and it's a lot of really good work done by really switched on people, but modelling can shed light on the problem, but it hasn't to date, and I don't think it will in the future give us a silver bullet to the problem we have. And the problem we have is that the lack of cost-effective mitigation tools, high targets, and the complexity of New Zealand farms. Like every farm's different and dramatically so. So modelling will shed light on that. Modelling will show here's parts that can be tweaked. The better the modelling is, the better that is. But like Cam and Andrew say, like that's ultimately it comes down to a political decision, right? How much do we want to reduce exports by X percent to reduce emissions by Y percent? And there will be a range in which some organisations are happy with, and a range in which others. And there's no magic bullet from modelling. And I think modelling is just a tool to inform, and a valuable tool, but it's just a tool nonetheless.
Okay, this one might be more of a science-based question. So even though methane is separated through Waka, will we continue to push the fact that livestock methane is cyclic, adding no extra methane to the climate than it has many, many years with solid evidence?
Yeah, short answer, yes, we will continue to push the argument around the short life of methane. So we've had our sort of livestock numbers in New Zealand peaked in 2006 and have been stable since then. I think there's been a slight, tiny little reduction. And at the last time it was measured, wasn't quite in line with the GWP star of 0.3% per year. I think it was just outside of that. It was pretty damn close. So, you could, if you were focusing on that metric, you could say since 2006, we've been on the trajectory for no additional warming. However, be aware that that metric does require you go back 20 years. So using that would still give you that there has been warming, an increase in warming. But yes, look, we are strongly going to keep pushing that position and argument. Actually be discussing how we do that better in our Federated Farmers Board meeting tomorrow. So hopefully we'll have some good stuff to share in the future on that.
Just to add to that too, Andrew, that cuts across a number of areas, right? It's not just targets. Like, unfortunately, it's not stable methane. You're all good. There is that 0.3% reduction that makes the maths and policy much trickier. But feds along beef and lamb and dairy NZ last year, really pushed for a split gas nationally determined contribution. So that'd be an international target to match up to the split gas approach we take to domestic targets. So that would make a whole lot of more sense. So that means that stable methane and or slightly reducing methane doesn't put a whole lot of pressure unnecessarily on the other sectors of the economy, or that we won't have to go and spend billions on international units. We also push for split gas emissions budgets, because right now we've got separate targets, but when the Climate Change Commission's designing budgets, they've got to put them all together. So the sort of the wins we have there are really good and really important, and they happened before I started here, so I can't even take credit for them. But they're sort of halfway done, so we need to follow through with other areas, and that's something that we with other bodies like Beef and Lamb and Dairy NZ are really pushing for.
And the debate is wider than that too, and that if you look at the ETS, it's all based on international climate change standards. The National Greenhouse Gas Inventory is based on international standards, so we can push the debate in New Zealand, but ultimately a lot of the high-level targets and reporting is all based on international standards. So I know that Andrew and others are working with other countries that also have the same challenge, particularly Ireland, around getting those international standards upgraded to represent the short cycle of biogenic methane, and hopefully feed that through into new definitions going forward. But that is a big battle. We are starting to see some of that conversation happen through the latest IPCC reports, thankfully. But it's a big challenge to get some of those international standards changed.
Okay, we have hit the 1 p.m. mark, so if you need to go, that is absolutely fine. And if you missed the start, there was a little bit of a hiccup with the Zoom links getting out to everyone. If you missed the start, a recording will be available as soon as possible. We do have a couple more questions that I think our speakers are happy to answer, so if you need to go, that is all right. Don't forget about the survey that's coming out today some point. It's really important to get your feedback. So if you need to go, thanks for joining us. We'll answer these last couple of questions. Okay. How should we be thinking about the tension between emissions per kg of product versus per hectare? The latter is more directly linked to total emissions.
Yeah, I can kick that off. It's a good question. Yeah, these questions are always really impressive when you guys have clearly thought about it a lot as well. And the challenge, the way I personally have been thinking about this is, what do consumers care about? What do people care about? And I think that saying this litre of milk or this kilo of meat that has this many emissions, that should care more about than this kilo of milk or meat was grown on a farm with this many emissions per this many hectares. I think there's a European country, I think it's the Dutch, there was a study came out in which they were making the case, because they have the most emissions per hectare, because the most stock per hectare, they're the most climate efficient, because they're foregoing production on the most land that could be afforested. So I think that argument, you could spin that way. You also get into, how does that work for new farms, for expanding farms? But it is something that we have to look into. I think it's a valid something to look at, your emissions per hectare, but we don't want to see a bunch of smaller intensive farms being necessarily disadvantaged, or even going out and buying large farms so they can dilute their number. But both are certainly worth considering, but I've certainly think that the output, the sort of on your product at the end of the day, that's what farming's about, is the product you're producing should probably take priority.
Yeah, I'll just add, if we go back to the Paris Accord, and you look at that statement, that we need to reduce emissions whilst maintaining production, and that really does go to, globally the world needs to improve its efficiency. I think, however, it doesn't have to be a trade-off between the one or the two. If I look at my own farm's emissions, the last time I looked at the bell curve, when it was done per hectare and per kg of product, I was in exactly the same spot on the bell curve in both those categories. So it sort of showed me that yes, whilst I'm reasonably efficient per kg of product, I'm also reasonably efficient per hectare as well. But to me, if we're looking at if we're taking it right back to that global level of the Paris Accord and what we've got to do as a planet, that's how we achieve it. And to me, that's the key thing. There was one other point I was going to make, but now it's slipped my mind, so never mind.
I just add to that too, Andrew, like your point around it's not they're not mutually exclusive, right? And we don't have to pit one against the other. If we're looking at a system like we've talked in the last set of webinars, we talked about that output rebate a lot. I think if we were to do it, you'd have to compare farm systems to farm systems, and we'd look into comparing like to like, and where you draw that line, that will have impacts. But you wouldn't want a sprawling high country low intensity farm being compared to an intensive farm where they're bringing all the feed on like that. That doesn't make a lot of sense, and that will cause issues. But you can change the system, and we could look into how we could change it so we're comparing like to like. The more you do so, the more you dilute the effect of it. But there will be a line in the middle in which it makes sense to do so. So yeah, I think that's an important one, that we don't want to just that the two aren't saying, well, we're going to advantage this farming system or this farming system. I think either approach could work with any farming system. It's just ensuring that you get that balance right at the start.
Okay, this is our last question we've had come in. Future-proofing our position is a pragmatic thing we should always be aware of, but surely our industry levies should be spent researching ways to lower emissions rather than setting up a parallel ETS so we can pay our own money back to ourselves.
Yeah, good point. And I think, that sort of principle has come through quite clearly in the work that's been done around the need for that the revenue recycling is, we do get the bang for buck comes in the research and the development. And that's where we get the results. Certainly one idea we were tossing up a few weeks ago was, geez, should we just, increase the levies to the current levy bodies and insist that it's spent on climate change R&D. There's always a risk that then it morphs into other areas. But yeah, and that's sort of why there is the focus on how can we ensure that we reduce the admin cost, that we don't overcomplicate things with this, that basically the vast majority of that money is invested into things that will promote research and development or data interoperability, better tools for farmers, that it's, as the saying goes from the old America's Cup ad, it's stuff that's going to make the boat go faster rather than anything else.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So just to give you some context, the numbers, if you've seen it in the engagement document, if we were to use the prices that are talked about in there and paid the ETS value for sequestration, that over half of the money collected would go straight back into this parallel ETS essentially. So on those numbers, you'd actually halve the levy on the gases if you were to knock out the sequestration side. So we're not suggesting that that's exactly what we want to do, but I'm just very wary that the more we pay for sequestration for it's essentially a stuff that's already on farm, that's already happening, the higher the levies for all farmers will have to be. And that's the problem that we've got, is that essentially this is just a big money go around, as the question says, between farmers, and we don't think that's necessarily fair. Not to say we want to get rid of it altogether, but we just need to be careful that it doesn't swamp the entire system and we end up with ludicrously high pricing for emissions just to pay for another ETS. So yeah, it's one of the options is that we can build this the sequestration model so that hopefully one day we can just slide that into the ETS and it becomes part of the ETS pricing, and then it's out of Waka Eke Noa altogether, which is good. But in the meantime, yes, we want to make sure that there is enough, or that the focus of the money is going on making change happen, as Andrew says, around new technologies, but also a little bit on getting that stuff on farm too, because you can invent a new technology, but there is also the need to educate farmers about it and get it implemented on farm. So there's the R&D and then the engagement and implementation as well.
Just to add to that too, putting money into R&D and putting money into the rollout of it's really important, and it's really important to get it done for tools that work for New Zealand. But the other part of it is getting that regulatory framework, which those two words, I will probably lose about a dozen people after I've said regulatory framework, but that is really important. That Bovia, which is also known as 3NOP, if anyone's heard of that, that's available for use by Brazilian and Chilean farmers right now, and New Zealand farmers don't have a regulatory framework for it. There's a GMO ryegrass being developed. It's looking quite promising. If that comes on board, we can't use that here. DCD was another one. It caused trade issues because there wasn't a regulatory framework for it in a trade sense. There's a number of tools that could be used on the horizon or could be used now that can't be used because there's no pathway for farmers to use it safely or farmers to use it at all. And that's one that it's good that Waka Eke Noa has government as a partner of it, because we've been making the point that something needs to change. We submitted on getting 3NOP used 2 years ago and nothing's changed. And that's something that, look, we need to keep putting money into R&D, but we also need to get the green light from government to use some of these tools safely. So that's, like we say, we need to develop these tools. We need to develop them in a lab. We need to develop them for commercial use. Like Cam says, we need to get that extension work done, and then we also need to make sure that there's a green light there, so that I think there is a really good case for putting money into all of that.
Awesome. Thanks very much, guys. We'll finish it up there. If we didn't get to a question that you've popped in very recently, or you just need to think on things and then have a question, you can email us, or you can go to Fed's Voice, as I mentioned earlier, or there will be a recording of this available as soon as possible. Thanks again to everyone for joining us, and we really appreciate the engagement and feedback. Have a great day.